With me today is Abdulai Silá, all the way from Guinea-Bissau. A round of applause, please. And Naivo, all the way from Madagascar. And today's conversation, please. And today's conversation is very important for several reasons. We explore firsts. And as you well know, firsts are very important. Your first kiss, your first job, no matter how shitty it was, and your first opportunities to shine. But why this is important today is because their literary outputs were the first ever to be translated into English in their countries. So today, what we are going to do is have a deep dive, have conversations around the importance of firsts, but also the problematic nature of firsts. So I'm going to give them an opportunity first just to introduce themselves briefly and just share the importance of being here and who they are and give context. I'm hoping everyone has read their work. If you haven't, it's okay. I'm not going to put you to shame, but maybe just a little bit. Who has read their work? Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to begin with you, Abdulai. Please, just a brief introduction for those who haven't read your work, but most importantly, just give us a brief background of the ultimate tragedy. Just over to you, sir.
Thank you, Natasha. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Abdulai Silá. I come from Guinea-Bissau, and I started writing novels. Now, after publishing 5 of them, I switched to plays. And so far I have 8 plays published. The Ultimate Tragedy is the second novel I wrote. I was a student at that time. I was studying engineering, electrical engineering. But I felt somehow compulsed to write that. It was part of a trilogy that I wanted to write. Because my initial plans was to write just 3 books, one about the past, the present and the future, something like that. And the first one I wrote was about the present. And then I wrote the Ultimate Tragedy because I had the feeling that we needed another narrative about the relationships between the colonizer and the colonizer. And this is what the Ultimate Tragedy is about. And the title has to do with a wish that I had, that colonialism would be the last tragedy. Unfortunately, it was not.
Thank you so much, Abdulai, and I will come back to you and explore the themes around the ultimate tragedy. Naivo, I spent a considerable amount of time Googling why you didn't go by the name Patrick in your writing and why Naivo. First, just for my own curiosity, why Naivo? What does it mean? But also, let's also delve deep into, beyond the rice fields. But yes, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, my name is Naivo. The long first name is Naivo Harisua, but the diminutive is like, for Patrick, people say Pat. So for Naivo Harisua, people say Naivo. So Patrick is the Christian middle name, and Naivo is the Malagasy first name. So I'm happy to be here. I'm a writer from Madagascar, and actually I'm particularly happy to be in Nairobi because I grew up partly here. I spent 3 years here when I was an adolescent, and it's a kind of emotional return for me. So thank you for coming here to this session. And I'm looking forward to a dialogue with you, with the public, the readers. Um, to talk a little bit about my first novel, which was the first Malagasy novel to be translated in English. It's a historical novel. So, as a writer, I think my main focus is writing historical fiction. Why is that? It's just because as a young man, a long time ago, I felt compelled to rediscover this past, this history of my culture, of my country, that had been, I wouldn't say destroyed, but it's something like that. Destroyed by what? By two big waves. The first big wave was the rise of Christianity, and the second one was colonialism. So when you end up being a young Malagasy in the 20th century, it's very common that you don't know anything, or you know very little about your own history. And I found that very wrong and very shameful. And that's actually what decided me to become a writer. So, and that explains why my writing is focused on historical fiction. So, as I mentioned yesterday, I was trained as a mathematician, but I'm happy that I left mathematics and embraced literature. So, the title of the novel is Beyond the Rice Field. In French, it is Au-delà des rizières, and in Malagasy is Akochan Valapari. The title itself is has something to do about the contact between the Malagasy world and something that is beyond the ocean, which means the contact between the Malagasy culture and the European influence. And actually, the story of Behind the Rice Field is set in the early 19th century. So the 19th century is a really pivotal century for the history of Madagascar, because this is the century where everything happens. And even contemporary society, Madagascar now, has lots of legacy from the 19th century. You can see that, for example, in a city like Antananarivo, the capital, you can see where is the place where the nobles used to stay, and where today the rich and the powerful still live. And you see the place where the slaves were, and today is the place where the descendants of these slaves still live. These parts of the city called Ambantanan, the lower city. That's how it's called. So the modern Malagasy society is really reminiscent of the past, and reminiscent of the 19th century particularly. So Beyond the Rice Field is set in the early 19th century when the first British missionaries came to the highland Madagascar and started proselytizing and started building schools. And it's also the time when European influence became stronger and stronger. And that was way before the actual colonization of Madagascar, which only happened towards the end of the 19th century in 96, sorry. So this is the beginning. So I'm writing in Beyond the Rice Field about the beginning of the end in a way. So the story is about a slave who tries to climb the social ladder using craftsmanship. He's a carpenter. And the slave falls in love with the daughter of his master. So that's the story that I wanted to tell, because it has many aspects of Malagasy society in it. The aspect of the empowerment of the weak through craftsmanship and through knowledge. It has the aspect of slavery in it, and it has all the ingredients of the collision between Malagasy culture and European culture in it, because it happens at the very moment when the queen, Ranavalna I, became aware of the danger of European influence, because at the beginning she wasn't that hostile to European influence. But then she became aware, because of many factors, including international factors, because that is the time where the French began to attack the coasts of the eastern coast of Madagascar. In 1895, there was a French and British attack on the coastal city of Tomasna. So she became aware that the enemy was not only outside, the enemy was already inside. And she saw the British missionaries as the enemy, and she saw Christianity as the enemy. And she decided to protect, in a sense, the integrity of her kingdom by persecuting the Christian. So this is really a period of big social and political upheaval in Madagascar. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but yeah, looking forward to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naivo and Abdulai. Naivo, just before I move to Abdulai, I'm quite curious around the impact, before it was even translated to English, of your novel in Madagascar. What conversations did it spark, especially amongst the young people? I'm quite curious. You know, was it able to shift narratives or within your community or within the country?
Yeah, I think the first reaction was, really? Is it true that it was like this before? It was a reaction of surprise. And then, because it was published in French first, so you know, the 80% of Malagasy people, they don't read French. They read only in Malagasy. So obviously the conversation began only in French-speaking circles in Madagascar. So in a sense, in the upper class of Madagascar. But afterwards, I had the opportunity to do tours of schools in Malagasy schools in different parts of the country, and I was very happy to explain to the young people and to children what it was all about. Yeah, and I think maybe it started a little bit of a discussion about the past in Madagascar, hopefully.
Thank you. Abdulai, this is both, actually the question is to you both, you know. How is it reconnecting, you know, sort of with a forgotten past through the lens of foreigners and foreign reviews? Because it's one thing to write in the language that you know, but to see the impact and conversations it's generating amongst foreigners, you know, what was that impact and how did that feel to you?
Well, I read some comments from people. I'm talking now about the English translation, okay? Then we can talk about the original version. There was people were very generous because most of the critique was written by either Africans or people from African ascendant. So I liked it because it is a subject that is not much appreciated in other parts. Talking about the relationships between the colonized and the colonizer and putting the colonized in the primary role, a lot of people don't like that. I can just give you an example. The book was published over 20 years ago. And then it was published, in my country. Then it was published in France, in Brazil, in Italy, UK, Germany, but it was never published in Portugal. Because they want, I guess, they want to keep that perception that the colonizer was always the master. But in that book, I tried to give another version of what could have happened. I say could have happened because it is a fiction, okay? But again, back to your question. Yes, I felt very, at some level, honored because by that translation, an extra opportunity was given to other fellow Africans mostly, and scholars also on the Western Hemisphere, to hear something, another narrative about the tragedy. Basically, it is.
Thank you. Naivo, just exploring the same conversation, how was it discovering, and even for the people within your country, their own culture through a foreign lens,
Yeah, the question that was asked to me was, why didn't you write it in Malagasy? So that was really the recurrent question. So the answer is not easy. So I always struggled to answer that question. So it has to do with colonial legacy, obviously. And as one of the writers here said, okay, I can write in Malagasy, but it wouldn't be as good. And also because if I wrote it in Malagasy, it would be a whole different story. Why? Because each language has its own vision of the world. And it would be quite different. So, yes, Beyond the Rice Field, as it was written in French, inevitably carries the weight, I would say, of European vision and this kind of thing. But anyways, the beauty of fiction is that the beauty of fiction and of storytelling is that it kind of transcends language and transcends culture. And I think that, how was my book received? When the French version was published in Paris, it was well received, but it was kind of, the French literary circles never really noticed anything about that. It was the reception of the book was kind of paternalistic in very learned Africanist circles, to say the truth. But then, when it was translated in English, I think the novel really had a rebirth. It was reborn. And that is the beauty of translation, because it gives another life to a work of art that is fiction, that is literary fiction. And actually, it's so nice to be the first. It's so nice to be the first because people are more open. They, in a sense, they forget maybe their prejudice, maybe their cliches. They are more open. Oh, this is something new. it's a new world, it's something, kind of, this kind of reaction. Yeah. As opposed to when Francophone people in Paris, for example, read the novel, it's kind of, oh, okay, so this is yet again a Francophone writer writing from a former French colony. Okay, so it's good. So I like okay. So we have a more favorable approach from the public being the first. So that's what I sensed.
We talked about the colonial roots and why you had to write, in French. But Abdulai, when I was just reading more about your work and how, while you wrote in Portuguese, it was not fluent Portuguese because there was a lot of African dialect, Fulani, there was Creole, and, there was a lot of struggle. Some words are not in the Portuguese dictionary, What was your experience translating the book? What feelings did you have? Because I think there's also a lot of pride in ensuring that, you included African language, even though you were writing in Portuguese.
Yeah, this is some sort of compensation. I should tell that I had not, this was my mistake, I did not put much time in writing that novel. As I said before, I was a student, so I had about maximum 6 weeks, the summertime, to write it. And if I try to do it in another language, it would take me more time to do it. So Portuguese was the language that I had. I was more comfortable with writing novels. At that time, I was in Germany, and my working language was German. Nevertheless, I decided, because of lack of time, to write it in Portuguese. And I had the feeling that this is an issue that I should take seriously and put some, let's call it patriotism on it. Because the narrative itself puts some certain issues in the first line. So talking about the dialogue, for instance, it should be set in such a way that it corresponds to the level and to the intentions of the character. I cannot put a chief who never spoke Portuguese. Talking Portuguese as someone who, used the language on a regular basis. No. So I tried to translate his thought, his way of speaking in another language. That brought me problems because besides the fact that it is about a subject that is not much liked by a certain group, mostly, I don't want to say European, Portuguese editors, and some influent people in Portugal. They didn't like it. Even today, they want to sell us the image that colonialism was something very nice, very soft. They try even to forget slavery and all these bad things that they committed, And then comes someone to remember us, the things, and putting a native African, in first place. They did not like it. So my soft vengeance was to misuse their language, but in an artistic way, okay? So the book had a different receptions. The same version in Portuguese that was published, unedited in Brazil. It was several, there were states in Brazil, it was the first, and the first place in the reading list of the students and Afro-Brazilians. Well, that gave me a lot of pleasure because I achieved two goals: bringing that version of the story and at the same time bordering the former masters.
I think the word for today is soft vengeance. So carry that with you. Naivo, while it is such a brilliant and important thing that you're a first, what unpleasant truths does being a first reveal? The first to be translated.
I think my novel was written in 2012 in French, and it was translated in 2015 in English. And it's the first novel from a Malagasy writer to be translated in English. It's not the first fiction, but the first novel. So this in itself shows something is wrong, because obviously Malagasy literature existed long before 2015. So why has it not been translated in other languages than French? And even actually, even the literary works of fiction in native Malagasy languages are not translated. Many of them are not translated in French. And the greatest Malagasy novelist, colonial and post-colonial novelist, whose name is Anje Anjaina, the greatest, and he has not been surpassed until to this day, has not been translated in French in any foreign language. So that shows that there's a problem. The problem is internal because of money, because there is no publishing industry. So when you publish in Malagasy, you have to pay for being published. So people, they just don't know how to publish their work. And this kind of stifles the creativity of the local writers. So lucky writers like me are able to write in French and tend to be published in other places, in Paris, for example. So it's easier. But even then comes the external barrier. How come only in 2015 in the English world? So it shows that our countries are still compartmentalized, yes. And this is a problem because we share more cultural values between us Africans than with Europeans. I'm sorry. So how is it that we are not well connected with each other? So this is something that we have to address, I think. This is an issue that we have to address. So that's the unfortunate aspect of being the first.
I mean, thank you. And just building on that, Abdulai, we see that there are many stories not being told. Beyond the Rice Fields was the first Malagasy book I read, I'm ashamed to say. How can we overcome these barriers? How can we ensure that just even beyond Guinea-Bissau, within the continent, before we even think about the global north and others, how do we ensure that more Africans have a deeper understanding of the histories and the culture and the stories in countries whose languages are not as common?
This is one issue that worries me a lot. This inability of the Africans, all of us, to promote a better way of knowing each other through literature. Okay, books published in one language in one part of Africa are not available in the other part. Sometimes even in the neighboring countries. You see, this is an issue that we need to address, and it is somehow a shame that 50 years after independence, we are still at this stage. People are more worried in, reading foreigners than Africans. This is part of mindset that we need to address too. We have great writers in all these countries. The issue is they are not known. There are a couple of them that are published. As Naivo said, you need to be published in Paris, London, or wherever, to be recognized in your own country. This is not fair. This is not acceptable at all. So one of the challenges we have is to promote, in my point of view, initiatives, events like this one, that gives the Kenyan the opportunity to at least hear about some work, some books, something on the literature field that is done somewhere in Africa. So, to deal with this, we think we need to, besides addressing this issue itself, to put more emphasis on teaching literature in our educational system, to make the young people be more aware of the challenges, more interested in books published in Africa, and make them available through translation, by all these means available. Because if we don't do it, we will remain somehow colonized. Because our folks will always be Europe, Europe, Europe. I'm writing in a way that an editor in Europe, likes my writing. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know if I answered your question, but this is...
You answered it perfectly. And, well, thank goodness for the Macondo Festival. Well, I would love to hog the mic and just speak to these lovely gentlemen. I would also like to invite the audience to this conversation. So I am sure we all have questions to ask. I'm just going to take a couple, and we're going to engage, allow our panelists to get back, and then, continue with the conversation. So I'm going to begin by taking 2 questions. Yes, please tell us your name, and, your question, short and sweet, and punchy.
My first question is, and I think you've sort of answered it, is, are the children of your country reading your books? And I'd like to speak a little bit more to that. Because if they are, how did you do it? And if they're not, what are you going to do about it? Because it's wonderful to hear you. And the second question is to Naivo, and I think I'd already warned him I'd ask him, because he's a scientist who has dared to go into the arts. I think I'm more in the science. I wouldn't say I'm a scientist, but that's the reason I'm asking you this, is one, how you got to the point where you said, okay, fine, math is feeding me, but my soul wants to do the art. So how did you make that transition? Because you have to eat, right? But over and above that, when you got to writing, this space, because as you said, it's about money, it's about financing, who's going to publish your book. Did you find that the story you wanted to tell was influenced by, or the people to whom and to what you wanted to write it to was influenced by this sense that, then how do I get it published? Did money let's just be honest, let's call it that or whatever else.
I like what Abdulai said, appealing to the European gaze.
Yes. So so you started off with I want to tell this story and I'm ready to give up my career. When you got there, what was that experience, and did it color in any way the book you wrote in the end?
Those are two heavy questions, so we'll take that first. Let's begin with the last question to you, Naivo.
Thank you. The fact is that I was studying mathematics, and I taught long years in maths. And in a sense, I'm lucky because maths can be an art, right? It can be like poetry. If you're very good, if you become through the very 1% elite mathematicians, which I was not part of. So, and this particular science called mathematics can become very dry. And this kinds of triggers something in your mind. Because as an African, you tend to see science as a way to do as well as European, as Westerners. Okay, I can understand this kind of equation, I can solve this kind of problem. I can try to work on this kind of conjecture. Yeah, maybe we don't acknowledge it, but in some ways, at least at the time I was a student, this is the kind of illusion that science gives. And luckily, I was disillusioned at one point. I saw that it was really a kind of dry universe that didn't give much to me. And this is when I rediscovered my culture and my history. And how did I deal with this transition? Actually, I abandoned math, whatever the costs. I did not have any illusion that I would become a rich novelist and prize-winning novelist and this kind of stuff. And to this day, I don't live of my work of literature. And I'm very happy with it because it's an activity that comes from the bottom of my heart, and I can do it if I can even with having a day job. So science, it's the past. The present is literature, and obviously you have to live as a human being, which is not bad, because I have a day job and I interact with people, and I'm still caught in the struggles of society, and which is good. And on top of that, I'm doing literature, and that helps me really have a real inspiration in my life. And yeah, so that's how I made the transition and how I do it. Thank you.
There really is a bit of that. This is the first time I've heard the words math, poetry, and art in the same sentence. So, I mean, over to the next question to you, Abdulai.
Yeah, first of all, I should tell you that an author never feels that he is read enough, because there is an ambition, to spread the word. And first, okay, and first of all, in your own country. My book was published first in my country. So it was a subject of some sort of critics, because still there are some people that have their minds colonized. They do not appreciate the way one writes. I have my own way, and I do not want to be seen as someone who wants to follow the way the so-called great writers somewhere in former metropole write. I wanted to be part of a movement that, sets up a new way, a new narrative, if in both form and content. So we had a real challenge to make the book available. First of all, before reading a book, you have to have it available. And it was a big challenge too, because we wanted that story to reach as many people as possible, including in some villages where money was an issue. They don't have money to buy, let's say, school books, not to say, So we had to find a way of dealing with this issue. We tried several things, including involving in an appropriated way the support from outside. So we set up a pen club. Some of you may have heard, Pen Club International. So we explored opportunities, such as they have some funds that they make available to support initiatives like creating reading clubs for young people. We set up a lot of reading clubs. We gave them the books for free, and we made sure they are read. So this is really things that make our work in our countries very exciting and rewardful, believe me. There is a feel of joy and I don't know how to call it. When you see that your book is read, is commented in places that you could not imagine, okay? So, it's what I had to do.
I'd just like to flip that question, because often I wonder if it's an unfair burden to place on writers. You're telling the stories, you're doing the work, then you have to do an additional work of making everybody readers in society. So how can we help, what can we do to ensure that your work gets read, the entire ecosystem? How can it work in favor to create a reading culture, just to build off of what Koi said? Naivo, I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. To come back to your first question, I think that translation activity has to be supported. I remember there was a time in Madagascar we had a socialist period, right? There was a Marxist-Leninist regime, and they were able to translate Marxist literature, not really literature, booklets in Malagasy, and spread it into the schools. So my idea is that translation is really critical here in terms of allowing children to have access to other works of literature from African countries. And this can be done. Why are some authors, Malagasy authors, some of them were able to translate plays by, I don't know, Molière and this kind of stuff. They were able to translate it in Malagasy. Why couldn't we do it for African playwriters? I think that would be a wonderful. It's not. I don't think this is something that is really difficult to do, even in terms of financing, in terms of funding, but it does require some kind of political willingness to do. I think that would be a very first thing to do, is to, especially for the children, to support the translation industry, I guess. I would love to have read Things Fall Apart in Malagasy when I was young. I only discovered it in university, so that's wrong. This is a really essential part of our culture and our literature, much more than Gustave Flaubert and whatever. So yeah, this is a work that we have to do. And second is that maybe we have to bring training on other European languages earlier in the curriculum, in the educational system. For example, in Madagascar now, we are very lucky to have more and more young people who are able to read in English, and that is something that has to be reinforced. I think at one point we even had a president who had a very good idea to include English as an official language, but unfortunately, I don't know if it's a coincidence, he was overthrown by a coup d'etat 2 years after. I'm not saying it. So yeah, that was a good idea, because ideally our young people should be able, not necessarily to write in English or to write in Portuguese, but to be able to read in these languages, which are African languages. French is an African language. It doesn't belong to Paris anymore. English is an African language. It belongs to many African countries. So we have to support these African languages and bring training on these particular colonial languages early in the curriculum, I think. Thank you.
We're going to take 2 more questions for now. One on that side, and I saw a hand up here.
So who should I start with?
You're closer there. So
Okay.
mathematically.
And math matters in this panel. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. My name is Mareike, and I want to pick up on a point, Naivo, that you made about that every language has its own characteristic in a way, right? It has its wrapping paper that changes what the present inside looks. And I would love to hear how you think English changed your text when you maybe read it back in English, and were there moments, phrases, concepts, even terminology that you thought, no, this really couldn't be properly translated. There are words on the page here, but they don't exactly mean what I wanted to say. Thank you.
We'll take the next question, then we can take the question.
That's okay.
Thank you. My question was partly mentioned or touched on by Naivo, but it's actually to you, Abdulai, because I sensed some sort of dissonance, if I could call it that, when you talked about what did you say? With the Portuguese. So you talked about using their language to exactly that was your words, and I'm interested in the use of their language, having in mind that, as Naivo said, Portuguese is the official language of Guinea-Bissau. And especially in the linguistic discourse of decolonization of language that involves localization, and as Naivo says, French is an African language, it no longer belongs to Paris. We see that in Kenya a lot. You're talking about Kenyan English, you're talking about South African English. So how is it that you're still talking about their language, yet it's a language that's spoken by, it's an official language in your country? Thank you.
So we'll begin with the question of direct and then
Yeah, about translation. Actually, I'm very lucky because I did not choose my translator. She chose me. It's an exceptional translator whose name is, she's American, whose name is Alison Charette. And she was traveling to Madagascar, trying to really look for Malagasy writers that could be translated in English. And that's how she discovered my novel, Beyond the Rice Field, and we started exchanging emails. And she said, okay, let's give it a try. So how did the translation process go? Personally, my kind of philosophy with translation is that let the translators do their work. Because to me, translating is not only like pushing a button. It's not like Google translation. It has nothing to do with this. It's a creative. It's a creative work. So I just told my translator, I just told Alison, so write it as you feel it and do whatever you want, basically. And that was extraordinary. The outcome of that was extraordinary because she wrote it in I'm not an Anglophone. I don't really, I'm not really able to catch the subtleties of English literature that much. But I saw that there was beauty in her translation, and I was very happy about it. And to this day, I do not regret this process of translation. What does it mean to me? Again, I think that my novel was reborn thanks to this translation. As with regards to English, not being an Anglophone, I'm not sure that I can speak really in an accurate way about this, but I think it gave it, or maybe it enhanced the poetic side of the novel. I think, yes. I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, Rachel, you asked you put a nice, very actual and pertinent question. The issue of language. Okay, saying our language versus their language. If we use it, and we should see it as being, as Naivo said, our own language. The issue is there are some nuances that I want you to consider. First of all, that book was written 1983. The war in my country, the Liberation War, ended 74. So it was 9 years after the end of an 11 years very violent war against the colonial power. Okay, so this is the first point. The second point, my first job was on alphabetization, to teach elders, fellows to read and write. Because as I mentioned before, at the time of independence, we had 90% of people that couldn't neither read nor write. Were out of the school, 90%, okay? Third point, we have a language that is spoken by the great majority of the people. And working in the alphabetization process, one of the issues we had to face is to teach in which language. So we had a choice. And at that moment, we had to make decisions that would affect the life of many of our fellow citizens. You cannot teach people read and write, basic reading. I'm talking about adults, not, you know, the children, you know, to teach them read and write in a language that they don't use, they don't master. It is useless. So we said, and I was part of that movement. I was 16 years old. But I actively participate. You know why? Part of my family had not an opportunity to go to school. So I was very concerned. And I knew what it was being an analphabet. It's a kind of blind person, walking without, you know, appreciating, you know, the colors that are there. So, in this context, we as citizens, because a writer is first of all a citizen, okay? And he has, in my case, and assume that responsibility to be part of the debate. In which language should we teach? I'm not saying that we should ignore the other languages. What I'm trying to say is we want, first of all, to teach people to read and write and do some science. Africans, as someone said, I guess it was a Nigerian author, they go to school to learn languages. In his own words, the Brits, they go to school, the kids, to learn science. We spent, can you imagine, in our high schools, even, how do you call it, Latin, all these old archaic language are taught. What for? You tell me. What can I do with it? It is, well, theoretically, it is nice, it is, you know, beautiful to learn some words in Latin, but, you know, what will you do with that? So, back to the question. Yes, we have a language, a European language that we inherited and that we assume as being ours too. But we cannot forget that we have our own language. And there are things, this is my point, that you cannot express in those languages. We have sort of food, sort of, plants. You can only call them in your own language. There are situations, you cannot describe them. Sentences, you cannot translate, it doesn't make sense. So as an author, how do you want to deal with it? There are sayings that we need, you know, to pass on. You have two choices. Either you use your own heritage, the knowledge transmitted through the sayings, or you use somebody else's knowledge. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. It is ridiculous. While using your sayings, you know, your people. You know, this is another issue. Who are you writing for? Are you writing for the European reader? Or are you writing, you know, for your neighbor to read? Depending on the answer you give to these questions, you know, you will have a lot of other questions, collateral questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm quite tempted to go beyond time. But I would thank you for that brief applause, but I'd like us to give a final and louder round of applause for our fantastic panelists.